This podcast is made possible through listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina and the Charleston Festival by Historic Charleston Foundation, celebrating houses, history, and culture with tours, concerts, workshops, and more. March 13th through April 13th. Learn more at thecharlestonfestivalsc.org.
And the Florence County Museum, announcing Fighters for Freedom, William H. Johnson Picturing Justice, organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum with support from Art Bridges. Johnson's evocative work is on view now through August 10th. flocomuseum.org.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, welcoming you to our podcast about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. This week, Alfred Turner and I will be talking with Johnny D. Boggs, award-winning writer and a native of Timmonsville, South Carolina.
Johnny began his professional life as a journalist, but eventually started a career as a novelist, short story writer, and the author of several books about cinema. But he really found his calling in writing stories about the American West.
His latest novel, Bloody Newton, The Town from Hell, has won Johnny his 10th Spur Award from the Western Writers of America. Johnny, it's great to have you back with us on the Journal. I very much enjoy it, although it was kind of gory. Your latest book, Bloody Newton, The Town from Hell. But before we get into your book, I want to talk about you and your career.
Now, before we go too much further, can we introduce him as Johnny D. Boggs, well-known writer of Westerns, Mysteries, and?
Well, Johnny D. Boggs, 9 times winner of the prestigious Spur Award from Western Writers of America, and also the winner of the Owen Wister Award for lifetime contributions to Western literature.
Oh, that Johnny D. Boggs.
That Johnny D. Boggs.
Okay.
And someone who had a tangential connection to South Carolina or lived here for quite a while was John Jakes, also won the Owen Wister Award.
You're in good company.
All right. When you were growing up in Timmonsville, you now live in Santa Fe, but you grew up in a small town in the Pee Dee. You said you always wanted to be a writer, but early on, you got kind of sidetracked into journalism. Now, what was it that really made you want to be a journalist?
Somehow I got it into my mind that, you probably just don't start off writing books and making a living out of that. I played high school football, but I was I love baseball, but I was any state. But I was calling in newspapers with the results of the games, and they'd ask for details and stuff like that. And somehow in the back of my mind, I just said, well, wait a minute. Maybe if I start out as a reporter writing for newspapers, that would give me a steady income, and then I could eventually become a full-time writer. No idea what that was going to take. So I decided to major in journalism and went to the University of South Carolina, and J School there had a pretty good program, a really good program, actually. And I just really liked it. And I was editor of the school Gamecock, which was tri-weekly then. Dr. Henry Price taught copy editing. I always say the AP style book was his Bible, and he was God, and you did exactly what he wanted, and it was a tough class. And but he caught me in my senior year. I was walking down the hall to the journalism program, and he called me and says, "I understand you want to move out west." He handed me a name. He said, "I just met this guy of the Dallas Times-Herald. I guess it was at a journalism seminar or something like that in Atlanta." He says, "Call him. I give him my name, and then send him a resume and some clips, and the rest is up to you." And I did. And it just happened that the Dallas Times-Herald was hiring a bunch of young, mostly fresh out of college journalism to expand their suburban program. Or coverage. And I got hired as a sports writer and did that for about a year and a half. And then there was an opening on the copy desk on the main paper and in the sports section. And they said, "Do you want this job?" And I started thinking, I was out in the Arlington Bureau. No one ever saw me in the downtown office. And I realized, hey, why don't you do that where you'll at least be seen inside the newsroom? And did that, worked my way up to assistant sports editor. I was assistant sports editor in charge of the night operation at the Times-Herald when it folded in 1991. And then I got a job at the Star-Telegram in Fort Worth. And again, worked my way up to assistant sports editor in charge of the night operation. And all the while, I was starting to freelance a little bit for magazines. And I had a few books, novels published by a small, now out of business, New York-based publisher that did Westerns. They were short Westerns, and they had to have happy endings.
Okay.
No profanity, no sex.
All right. Why Westerns? Why were you writing Westerns?
I think part of that was just growing up, coming up in the late 1960s, watching the Westerns on TV, Gunsmoke. My dad was always watching that on Monday nights at the time. And I get asked this all the time. And I said, well, if you've grown up in the swamps and tobacco fields and piney wood forests of South Carolina, and you watch these Westerns on TV where you can see forever, and you get to ride horses and wear cool hats and stuff like that. I said, well, that's what I want to be doing. So that was that from the kid. And then I started reading Westerns. At the time, about the only thing you could find in a bookstore was Louis L'Amour. But eventually I discovered other writers, Elmer Kelton and some short story writers, Jack Schaefer, who wrote Shane, and Monty Walsh. And that's what really inspired me more. I said, that's what I want to write like, or A.B. Guthrie Jr., writers like that, Dorothy M. Johnson. And just was fascinated with it, and I just started experimenting. So I wrote a bunch of short stories and then started getting some books published. And at one point I just realized at the Star-Telegram, I said, this isn't what it was like when I was starting out. I just said, I had this stupid idea where I told my wife, why don't we sell the house, move to Santa Fe, New Mexico, you get a job, and I'll stay home and write full time.
Wow.
And she was burned out on her job, and for some insane reason, she thought that was a great idea. So we sold the house, and she bought a house, used that money for a down payment on a house here, and moved out here, not knowing hardly anybody. And she went to work, and I stayed home and started writing.
Wow. There's one part of the journalism story, and that was when you went to college in journalism schools across the country were flooded because of the influence of movies like All the President's Men. You sure that didn't have something with your going to J school?
I didn't see All the President's Men until I was in college. So, but I knew about it, and I knew what had happened. And of course, you're studying all that in journalism too. But yeah, I can't say All the Presidents. It was an influence just because I knew what was happening. I just knew that this writing was what I wanted to do, and then reporting. I was kind of shy, but that kind of had to bring. If you're going to be a reporter, you can't be shy. So you have to, come out and ask the hard questions and things like that. And I got it before I even took a journalism class at Carolina. I got a call from a sports writer because I was calling in the scores and talking to sports writers. So I knew all the reporters by name at the Florence Morning News. And this is Florence Morning News. With this circulation of maybe 30,000. Had 3 sports editor and 3 sports writers. And then they'd have summer openings. And I just got a job when one of the interns quit working as a news reporter at the Florence Morning News. And one of the sports writers called me and said, hey, there's an opening here. Just why don't you call the city editor? He gave me his name and, say you'd like to fill in. I didn't realize that was a second intern that city editor had gone through. But yeah, so and I realized why quickly. But it was good training. So by the time I was taking my first journalism class the fall semester, I had experience. Well, and journalism was a lot different, like I said, in those days. I mean, by the time I was getting out in 1998, it was changed, and now all my friends who are the few that are still in the business, they'll sometimes say, "Did you know in 1998? Did you know what was going to happen in newspapers? Is that why you got out? If so, why didn't you tell us?"
Well, you were talking about newspapers in South Carolina that have dramatically changed since you worked for them. The Florence paper, the state newspaper, you didn't work for them, but you corresponded with them. It's a different world.
It's sad, actually, in a lot of ways, because I think we still need newspapers, and especially these days. That's one of the things you can blame the internet. And there are papers still, and people are reading now, still online. So it's still there, but it's just not the same. When I was assistant sports editor, probably at both papers, we had a staff of probably a dozen copy editors, somewhere around there, and then part-time agate clerks and full-time agate clerks. So you're managing a staff. I'm managing a daily night shift at the Star Telegram and Dallas Times Herald. You probably had 6 copy editors working, including a layout editor and SWAT, which was what we call basically the copy desk chief, and several ag clerks. And, I called a paper once just to try to track down a friend. And the one person who knew me and still left at the paper said, "Yeah, you wouldn't believe it now. We have one copy editor, and he's working in Kansas City doing all the chain newspapers. He's the copy editor for the entire chain, or in the Midwest part of the chain." Yeah.
So anyway, let's get to happier times. You're in Santa Fe. You're in Santa Fe, and you've already published a couple of books, but now you're going at it big time. And How did you do that? Did you hire yourself a fancy agent?
I joined Western Writers of America, which it's been around since the 1950s. You had to be a published writer of Western material to get in. So I had magazine articles, and I had a few books. So I joined. They would bring in editors, and they still do. You can make a pitch session with an editor. But one of the publishers, this is another thing that's changed in the publishing business. When I started out, if you had a book published, they would commission an artist to come up with the cover. Now it's all stock images. They just go to a stock supplier, and you can see the same covers on different books. But at the time, they would do that. And this one publisher, it was 5 Star, which was a hardback imprint of Gale Cengage eventually. They published original Westerns, but they published photos on the covers. And I met with the editor, and I said, "Hey," I showed her some of my photos, and she said, "Sure, yeah, just send in transparencies, 35 miller transparencies, and we'll pay you for those." And I started to get up, thanked her. I said, "Thank you," and I started getting. I said, "Well, I also have this book. This novel, Western novel I've been working on. It's finished, and would you like to take a look at it?" And she goes, "Sure. When you get home, just send me 3 chapters, which is standard. First 3 chapters, and a synopsis of the rest of the book." And I just sent that to her. I expected another rejection letter, which is what I was getting a lot of the time. But she said, "Yeah, I've read the first 3 chapters, and I've got to say that's pretty good. Can you send me the rest of the book?" And I said, "Sure." And then she called me back again and said, "Okay, I've read it, and I love the manuscript, but here's the deal. We only publish books through a literary agent, so the agency would have to take you on." Now, I've sent a letter and called the agent and recommended that they look at this book seriously. But bottom line, it's up to the literary agent. And so I waited, and the literary agent finally called back and said, "Okay, yeah, we like the book, but we don't publish one-book wonders." so I mean, it takes time to for a writer to build up a name. So she says, "Do you have any other books in the works?" And I said, "Well, I've just about finished this one." I told her a little bit about it, and I've got this other idea behind that one, and I've got this idea. And she goes, "Okay, all right, we'll take a risk on you. We'll gamble on you, and we'll take you on as a client." And I was with them until her husband died, and then she took over the agency, and then she just decided to retire. By then I had several books published through them and other publishers, and I had won Spur Awards. So speaking of Spur Awards, I guess I ought to update Bloody Newton just won the Spur Award, so that's my 10th. And it
Wow.
won for Best Historical Western Novel.
Congratulations.
Okay, what was that? What was that first book that you?
It was called The Lonesome Chisholm Trail. It was the first one that got published there. The first book I had published was for Avalon Books, and it was called Hannah and the Horseman, and they asked for a series of that, and I did that.
So, Johnny, how many novels have you published?
It's got to be around 60 now.
Okay.
Something like that. I've got to count somewhere, but
Well,
Westerns don't pay as well as thrillers or mysteries. So.
Well, on the cover of Bloody Newton, I don't know whether it's a stock cover or not, but there sure are a lot of bodies in the street.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this, and towards the end of the show, I want to get into our discussion of where the frontier has always been. But let's talk about Bloody Newton. You describe it in the subtitle as the town from hell.
Well, that's my editor's. My editor did that, because when I saw that, I said, well, there goes my chance of getting a book signing in Newton, Kansas.
Okay, all right, this is a problem between Kansas and Texas. Let's talk a little bit about the story.
Okay, well, it's the fourth consecutive cattle drive novel. And the first two, Return to Red River and 1,000 Texas Longhorns, won Spur Awards. And then the next one was Longhorns East, which was different in that it opens in England, and it's about an Englishman who settled, actual person who settled in Illinois and went down to Texas, bought a herd of Longhorns, and drove them to New York City. And that sold well and got great reviews. So, but Bloody Newton, he just wanted another kind of a cattle drive novel. But he also said that what he wanted was strong female characters, because women read more than men these days. And he said that would might pull them into this. He says, what's your idea? And I said, well, there was a cattle town, Newton, Kansas. It lasted 1 year. It earned the nickname of Bloody Newton. And it was the site of one of the bloodiest gunfights in Western history. And I knew at Bloody Newton I had him hooked because he loved that name. But then he added the town from hell. And I said, well, okay, all right. And of course he says you want two strong female characters, and the cover is a street scene with a man and a bunch of dead people. So I was like, I don't know how many women are going to think this is a women's book to read, but it sold well too, and like I said, won the Spur Award. But I had to create characters, and I said, okay, I'm going to have a father and son, and sons doing the cattle drive part of it. But I want to tell about how a cow town comes to be, and how a cow town decides it doesn't want to be a cow town anymore, which happened a lot because of the violence. So I thought of what characters could I use for females, and I said, well, I'll bring in a newspaper reporter, and then I wanted to do something different, something from the business end, and didn't want to do this, saloons or anything like that. So I said, so you cook.
You didn't want to have a Miss Kitty, right?
I didn't want a Miss Kitty. I wanted someone with a business mind and running a business that is not saloon related or prostitution related.
And for those people who are not necessarily familiar with ancient televised entertainment, that's from Gunsmoke. Miss Kitty, the saloon keeper.
Yes.
And lady, who we never got too deep into what she actually did. But yeah, she was the stalwart friend of the Marshal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Marshall's favorite person.
Yep.
Although if you watch some of the early black and white episodes when it first started,
they're different.
They are different. They're darker, and they're also a little more explicit, because you see cowboys walking with girls up and down the stairs. And wow, how did they get that past the censors? I guess they're just walking. Gunsmoke was a big inspiration for me too. So.
Okay, all right. So you've got the cook, the reporter, and you've got a cattle drive beginning in Texas. But why has it got to go to Kansas?
That's where the rails were.
Okay.
So that was the whole idea. That's what really launched the cattle business in Kansas. It was cheaper And even when the railroads first reached Texas, which came later in the 1870s, biggest known cattle town was Abilene, which started about 1867. After the Civil War, the railroads had reached Kansas by then, and there were better shipping, packing facilities in Kansas City and Chicago, and the rails could take cattle anywhere. But you had to get them to Kansas. And even when they reached later, the shipping rates were always cheaper in Kansas. So that's why they had to drive, 3 months, 4 months up the trail to whatever the cattle town happened to be. Started in Abilene, then it moves west, because the thing about cattle, Texas cattle carried ticks. And the ticks would jump off Texas cattle, which were the Longhorns were immune, but the local cattle in Kansas or Missouri or wherever they were going weren't immune, and it would kill the cattle. So there was always a quarantine line of where you could drive Texas cattle, and that's why a lot of the towns didn't last long, because people would develop, the farmers would get upset, and the towns would get upset because cowboys blowing off steam blew off more than steam. They blew off street lamps and windows and things like that.
Possibly various limbs of folk.
And true. So that's why Kansas became the center of the cattle industry.
So
and you could drive all the way up to Oglala, Nebraska, and get on the Union Pacific, but that's a lot farther. So it's money, right, actually. Mm-hmm. So the money was in Kansas, and that's where you went.
So this town literally just appears out of nowhere to become a cattle town.
Yeah, right. Okay. And it lasted one year. I mean, most of the cattle towns you'd see, Dodge City lasted the longest, probably. Abilene lasted for 4 or 5 years. But yeah, Newton lasted one season, and then they were tired of it. They were just finished with it after that.
So, you've got, as you say, two parts. You've got the cattle drive and you've got the town. So it takes, you said, about 3 months to get from Texas to Newton?
Sure.
And a lot can happen on that drive. You have a very dramatic scene where there's a thunderstorm and the cattle stampede.
Stampedes can be kind of a cliche because there's always a stampede, but it was something that actually happened a lot on cattle drive. Cattle were spooky. Anything could set them off. And you've got, average herd was probably about 2,000. You could run maybe 1,500. Most people didn't want to run a herd over 2,500. Because it's impossible to manage. Another thing I think most people don't realize, it's a long line. It's a long line to get all those cattle together and moving. And it took a lot of work. Cattle would be spooked easily. It's been said that they've stampeded over a sneeze.
It takes them 3 months to get there. Are they grazing all the way from Texas to Kansas?
Right. And that's another thing about the trails, I always think. You go where the water is. So the trail's can shift here and there because if it's not raining here. Another part is if you're late getting on the trail, a lot of the graze is going to be gone. So you're going to have to move this way or that. But they're grazing as they go. I read somewhere where, you're circling. There's always a night rider circling the herd. Part of that, they want to keep the herds pretty much where they are. You don't want to have to cover this ground again. So they're grazing at night. They're grazing when they can on the drive. I've actually worked on 2 cattle drives.
Really?
Yeah, a couple of ranches, and they invited me as a magazine writer just to travel along. The first one I did was in Arizona. It was about 4 days, and we were running 100 head of Hereford from the winter pasture, which is down low, to the spring graze, which is in the White Mountains of Arizona. And so it's 4 days on the trail. And, I'm riding, and it's just 100 cattle. 4 days on the trail, 100 cattle. When I'm finished, when the drive is finished, when I got home, I had to get a new pair of glasses because the dust and grit had scratched the lenses so much that I could hardly see out of them. So I think, 100 head, 4 days, think 3 months, 2,000 head. How many eyeglasses are you going to go through?
Well, I was going to ask you, you grew up in Timmonsville. When did you first ride a horse?
We had Timmonsville was actually, at the time, they had a big harness race, not too far from where I grew up. They had a harness track. So they raised a lot of standard breeds for trotters. So the first horse I remember riding, a friend of mine had a little filly called Bippy. And I remember just getting on, riding in the pasture. It's a fenced-in pasture. I was just riding around a little bit.
All right.
And then I remember when I was getting off, reined up, timing was absolutely perfect. I am swinging out of the saddle when a covey of quail fly out. The horse spooks just a little bit, and there's no way I can stop. So I fall. I'm holding on to the reins because I didn't want her to, she wasn't going to run far. And my foot got caught in the stirrup. So I'm hanging on, holding the reins, foot caught in the stirrup. She's bouncing around, and I'm thinking, I've seen this scene in a lot of movies and a lot of TV shows, and it's not going to turn out good for me. But she calmed down immediately. Friends are over on the other side of the fence line, and I'm probably thinking, what the heck is he doing? Quit showing off.
Oh, okay. All right. So you weren't a city slicker when you took your first cattle drive.
And I count. There have been 4 horse wrecks.
Okay.
If you include that one, 4 horse wrecks. The last one cracked 2 ribs, so that was probably the worst one.
Okay. Let's set up the gunfight in Bloody Newton. You got the cattle drivers are coming to town. What's going to generate the biggest gunfight in Western history?
Liquor was probably the strongest influence, but it was a ridiculous gunfight, actually. I mean, Kansans didn't like Texans, Texans didn't like Kansans, and that's part of it. So there was a little animosity between the police force, or alleged police force in Newton, and some of the cowboys, and they took exception to one of the so-called policemen, and there was some violence and some bloodshed. And then at a dance hall, the alleged police officer, shows up in the dance hall, and one of the cowboys took offense, and they just started shooting. You can glorify gunfights a lot of times. This is good versus evil or whatever, but this was absolutely a senseless shooting that should not have happened at all. First of all, cowboys weren't supposed to be carrying guns in town, and police officers were supposed to be upholding the law and not being thugs and brutes. So that was a huge problem there. And too much liquor, and it was open carry. You can carry your guns. If you had a ordinance against carrying of firearms, it was easy to get around. You could pay a permit fee to carry a gun, or carry a concealed gun that nobody could see. So, as I said, there's nothing you can glorify about the gunfight in Newton, Kansas. It was senseless. It was stupid. It left a lot of people dead.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out the sides here. You've got cattle drivers, you've got the police. Does this end up involving townspeople, that people are just shooting everybody? I mean,
a few of the people that were wounded were trying to get out, and they were just got caught in the crossfire.
Did the gunfight have something to do with the demise of Newton?
Absolutely. I think that's when the citizens really said, enough is enough. We don't want this. Move it out now. And Wichita was just down the road, and Wichita wanted the cattle business. So they did, and there was a spur line was being made to connect Newton to Wichita, so the cattle could get to Wichita. So Wichita took over, and Wichita lasted a bit longer than Newton. A lot of times you see that happening over and over again. And it's usually a gunfight that really ended it. I mean, Abilene was the Philco gunfight with Wild Bill Hickok, who was Marshal of Abilene at the time. That kind of ended there. That's when they decided they were done with it. There was a town called Ellsworth that lasted a few years, and a gunfight there in which a sheriff was mortally wounded. Dodge City lasted the longest, and it had its share of gunfights. But eventually that, and just again, the Kansas farmers getting tired of losing their cattle to Texas fever. So all those played a role in it. And eventually, of course, the railroad spread, and eventually, Texas found ways to lower their shipping rates, so it became a lot easier who ship cattle from Texas or anywhere else. And then, the West is expanding their outfits now, and Montana's becoming big, but the Northern Pacific's going through there. So it just eventually kind of, the great cattle drives were pretty much over by 1876, say. Although there'll be a few more.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about the expanded frontier ever moving west, and I know that a hobby horse you used to ride was, people forget that 18th century South Carolina was a frontier, and you've written about that as well. And it very much was a frontier existence.
People ask me where the West begins. I said the West actually begins when the first European settlers land on the eastern coast, and the West is 2 miles inland. And it was always moving westward until you reached California and the Pacific Ocean. So you could set a Western in South Carolina easy when it's the frontier, and they call them frontier novels. But I say, they're still Westerns. I mean, that was the West. I mean, James Fenimore Cooper, upstate New York, but he's writing Westerns. And I think that most people would agree that The Last of the Mohicans is a Western. It's just not west of the Mississippi River.
Well, I guess that means that William Gilmore Simms could have been writing some Westerns too.
He did. I've read a lot of his frontier stuff. And I said, that's definitely the West. He was an influence when I was writing Cane Creek Regulators, though. I mean, that's upstate South Carolina. And that was definitely Western. It's vigilante justice. So.
And of course, it really could blow people's minds that the first open range cattle operation was in the low country of South Carolina, and the term cowboy actually originated in South Carolina in the late 17th century, referring to African-American males who were tending the cattle. Of course, cow pens was where they gathered the cattle, and other, I was going to say varmints, but that doesn't sound right.
A variety.
A variety. And you may not know this, but besides the cattle that they would drive to Charleston, they also drove turkeys. They herded turkeys from the upcountry, and pigs.
Pigs, I could see. Yeah, turkeys. Wow.
No,
I've always wanted to do one of the cattle drives from Carolina or Virginia or wherever, and drive them either to Savannah or Philadelphia or New York City again. I think I'd have a little trouble getting that past an editor right now, but maybe one of these days I'd really like to do that.
Johnny,
talk about the early cattle drives in the Carolinas.
No kidding. At that time, it wasn't just from South Carolina. They were bringing, whether it was turkeys or cattle or pigs, would come from Tennessee and western North Carolina to South Carolina because the best market was to go to Charleston.
Right. I actually read I should have saved it or copied it or written it down, but I was just scanning through old newspapers in the 1700s. Could have been even earlier in the 1600s. But it was a Virginia paper, I believe. They were driving a herd of cattle, and it just talked about how rowdy these drovers would get in the town. So be prepared. So it had not changed over 200 years by the time they were going through Kansas. They were just as rowdy at that time too. Whenever they got to a city.
Hey, Charleston not only had the cattle drives, but it was a seaport. And before the Revolution, there was one tavern for every adult white males in the city of Charleston.
Wow.
So obviously they were catering to other than the locals.
Right.
That many taverns in the holy city.
Oh, yes.
Yes. I hate to say this, but we're at a point where we need to wrap up.
All right. Johnny, I hate to, but Alfred's giving me the wind-up sign. So any last words for our listeners before we sign off?
Thanks for having me. I mean, it's always great to talk about books, and it's always great to go back to the home roots, too.
It's fun having you back on the show, and congratulations on your 10th Spur Award. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today. I know that I did. Johnny D. Boggs has been a guest on the Journal several times over the years, and it's always fun to talk with him. Our conversation today gave us a chance to discuss not only his latest novel, Bloody Newton, The Town from Hell, but also his journey from a childhood in Timmonsville, South Carolina, to his life in Santa Fe, New Mexico, as well as his career as a celebrated author of Western fiction.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
Many of the books discussed on Walter Edgar's Journal can be found as part of the Walter Edgar's Journal Book Nook section at All Good Books in Columbia, South Carolina, or may be available from your local bookstore. We'll talk again soon.